Make sure you know what your colors, your logos, and your fonts are, and your sounds are, and some of the soundscapes. I want you to identify who your audience is, the target market, and why that they are important. Focus on the audience, making sure that what you're creating resonates with your people. Make sure you stay within the guidelines and your guardrails of making sure your brand stands out. Hey, it's Ronsley. Welcome, you AI geek, to Amplify AI. Consider this podcast your digital compass for you, the business leader wanting to use artificial intelligence ethically and in alignment with your brand's identity to achieve your business goals. Leading and running a business in the world of AI is like solving a Rubik's Cube blindfolded. But this podcast and I are here to make that easy. Every episode is a masterclass in unlocking techniques for using AI as a business leader, founder, owner. Thanks for being here. Let's learn.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. This is episode number 70. My name is Ronsley and this is Amplify AI. Today we're going to talk about something really cool, which is branding, and branding using artificial intelligence. Now, the single most important thing you can do with your business is have a brand that is consistent and known and recognizable. And today we're talking about brand personalities, values, visual representation. We're talking about experimentation when it comes to refining your brand based on feedback. We definitely talk about mistakes to avoid, ununiformity, inconsistency in learning, and just being generic with your brand, because we kind of tend to copy other people rather than create a brand based on our brand's identity. We talk about elevating that brand identity. We talk about captivating the audience and amplifying your brand story. It's a really cool episode and we've compiled it just for you. Come, let's learn.
When you're creating unique images, especially for your brand, there are some principles I'd love for you to think about. The first principle is, what's your brand's personality? What are your brand's values? And imagine what it would look like, what it would feel like, and what it would sound like. Make sure you know what your colors, your logos, and your fonts are, and your sounds are, and some of the soundscapes that you might use, even if you have a podcast or a YouTube channel. What are certain things that when you hear, you're reminded of your brand? Principle number 2 is to focus on the audience, making sure that what you're creating resonates with your people. Does it engage them? How does it engage them? How would you stop the scroll? Like when they are going through wherever they find these images that you're putting out, like make sure that you're like the DJ that plays for, your people. You want to be the one that guides them through this night, and you want to be able to create an experience. So focus on the audience. What will make them stop the scroll? Second principle. The third one is about experimentation, because it's not like a one size fits all, and understanding that this is new, understanding and seeing what resonates with your audience, what makes them send you messages back. Like I get a lot of messages from certain types of images that I have been creating recently, and I like to double down on those kind of images because it creates imagination. So take feedback seriously, and also understand the route, or the different route, depending on where you are, the journey that your customer takes, and how you can use imagery to make those journeys for your customers a lot more useful, a lot more amazing. So a couple of mistakes I want you to avoid. The first one being uniformity. Like make sure that when you're creating something, you are making and trying different things. And once you get your thing, then you can start creating it in the style of your brand. So make sure it's reflecting your brand. And the other thing with learning something new, especially learning how to create images in Midjourney, don't be inconsistent with it. Play with it, understand how it works, how different prompts work. You could create the same prompt and give it again and again, and you might get different results depending on how the machine actually imagines it in this new time. So be consistent with what you're doing. Here are 3 steps to get it done correctly. First is, what's your brand's language? Then we want to create the images based on that. And then finally, test and refine. So with step one and understanding your brand's languages and how you want it to appear to your audience, I spoke initially about the principles of look, feel, and sound. How do you want your brand to look, feel, and sound? But if you break that down, you just kind of decide what are your colors, like what is your main color and what is your secondary color? What are the shapes that your brand represents? Do you have an arrow that's part of your brand, or do you have boxes that are rounded edges versus square, sharp edges? So outline what your colors and shapes are, outline what types of images your brand represents. Are they powerful images? Are they images that denote calm? Are they images that create inspiration? What does your brand represent? And what kind of images represents that part of your brand? So look for those parts when you're deciding what kind of brand language your brand represents. Step two is creating the images, learning what prompts work, using the zoom and pan and how they can create really cool images, and also how to upscale images once you make them in artificial intelligence. So once you make them in Mid-Journey, you want to take that image and upscale it so that it's useful, like it's the highest quality that you can create, and you have upscalers that are available to do that. That's step two. Step three is about refining and testing. And in here, I want you to think about like what sizes are your images meant to be generated in? Like what kind of version in Midjourney are you using? You can use version 4, you can use version 5, 5.1, 5.2, which is the latest version. And they're going to keep improving the algorithm. And a lot of things change when you're creating them depending on which version of Midjourney you're using. Looking at using custom zoom, which is really powerful, and you can create a really cool video.
The idea here is that our goal is to make sure we elevate our brand identity, we captivate our audience, and we amplify our brand story. Now, when you're creating your brand, if you don't go through a formal designer who will help you highlight your brand guidelines, make sure you stay within the guidelines and your guardrails of making sure your brand stands out and it's repeatable, it builds trust, I suggest everyone do that. If you're not at a stage where your brand can afford something like that, I would suggest going and looking at how to create a brand guideline or brand style guide for your current brand, base it on your brand identity, and then we can start to do some really cool things, because everything then becomes very simple for you to implement, whether it's images, whether it's copy, whether it's different sort of stuff that actually highlights your brand value. Principle number one is specificity. So specificity doesn't mean a longer prompt. It just means that you're being very specific about what you want. It does not mean that you keep writing stuff, because that could confuse the artificial intelligence as to actually what you really want. So being specific in your prompt will allow you to actually attract what you're trying to achieve. So what is the image trying to do, and how does it align with your brand? So the first principle is specificity. The second one is about aligning it with your brand. So align it with your brand identity. And if you don't have an identity, then it becomes hard to align it with your brand. So figure out what your colors, logos, fonts, all those really important things are, so then you can align that with what you're trying to create. Think of your brand as this big musical symphony. These are the notes, these are the ways that you kind of align things when it comes to your business. Every image you generate, think of them as notes or in the harmony with your orchestra. Principle number three is to do iterative testing. So the first thing to do is test multiple prompts and images. What are you getting as a result of the different words that you're using? It'll allow you to refine it based on perspective and feedback. So when you put that out there, you'll see what people are saying, you'll see what is aligning, and you'll see how it kind of fits with your brand. Think of it as a chef where they're continuously tasting dish as it comes along to bring it together that actually creates this unique thing. So those are the three principles. Now let's talk about the mistakes to avoid. There are three mistakes that I'd love you to look at and avoid when you're creating mid-journey prompts. First thing is creating generic prompts. Now this comes from just copying and pasting prompts that someone has given you. That might help you understand what the different words are being used, but they don't really get you images in line with your brand. So do not use generic images. The second thing is to ignore your brand guidelines. It tends to happen with people who have their brand guidelines sorted. It tends to happen with founders because they forget that they've done this, and they forget that this work is so important to building trust. And the last thing is to overcomplicate prompts. So don't make them too overcomplicated. I kind of touched on that a little bit, so I'm not going to get into too much detail. So don't overcomplicate your prompts, don't create generic ones, and do not ignore your brand guidelines. 3 steps to doing this. The first is the blueprint, the second one is crafting, and the third one is refining. Let's get into each one of them. In the blueprint phase, I want you to identify who your audience is, the target market, and why that they are important, how you're trying to achieve them, why these images are going to grab their attention, and how you're going to create the images for what particular reason, right? That's your first step within the blueprint. Then you're going to review your brand guidelines and make sure that whatever you're trying to create for that audience is in line with the brand that you're trying to make, because that will build trust with that audience. And then you're looking for some benchmarking ideas. So look at similar brands for inspiration. What are they doing? And identify some gaps that you can plug in with the images you're trying to create. So look at what's out there, look at what's being done, and try to then use artificial intelligence at speed to be able to bolster your brand with some really cool images. Step number 2 is crafting the prompts. So in this step, you're going to find out a bunch of keywords and themes that resonate with your brand guidelines and your target audience. What I mean by that is, if you're trying to build trust through voice, which is what we do, right? We help businesses with their podcast and grow their business using their podcast, and their voice is very important. A lot of the times we think that we have to be loud for our voice to be heard. So that's a misconception I want to avoid. I want to be able to help people use their voice while they speak their truth, which is really what kind of clients we attract the most, is the ones that speak their truth. The second bit in the crafting prompts is to draft your initial prompts. So you draft your initial prompts and use your keywords to draft those prompts. And then finally, like peer review. When I'm talking about peer review, get a second opinion on what you're creating. So when you're saying, I want to create this image that looks like this and in these colors, and it does this, and this is what is in the background, this is what's in the foreground, this is what I'm trying to achieve, this is who the target is, then you want to get someone else's opinion, because again, perspective is everything.
Hey, AI Geek. Thanks for listening. Your job doesn't stop here. I want you to lend your voice to the conversation. So you can join those conversations, discussions, new trainings, new recordings, and the rest of the AI Geeks by going to aigeeks.co. Also, share this podcast with a friend, another potential AI Geek. Until then, much love.